3 months later, Captain Amy Brooks stood once again in the crystal dome of the Galactic Council chambers. But everything had changed. The same representatives who had laughed at humanity's offer to help now sat in stunned silence as she delivered her report. The air itself felt different, charged with possibilities that hadn't existed before. High Chancellor Vextar of the Zephyrians spoke carefully, his 3 eyes focused intently on Brooks. Captain Brooks, please confirm for the record that the Devourer fleet has maintained its ceasefire for the entire duration of your negotiations. Confirmed, Chancellor. Not only have they ceased all consumption activities in Council space, but they've actually begun what they call restoration projects in 3 previously consumed systems. Ambassador Zeketh of the Klaxons clicked his mandibles in rapid patterns that Brooks's translator identified as extreme confusion. Restoration? The Devourers are returning consumed matter to previous locations? Not exactly, Brooks replied. They're using the raw materials they consumed to build new structures. Space stations, orbital platforms, communication networks. Infrastructure that could support life, but designed for species that haven't evolved. Yet Admiral Thisara of the Gorvani rumbled from her position at the council table. Captain, I have witnessed the negotiations personally, but I still do not understand how your species accomplished what we could not in 50 years of warfare. Brooks looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives of 12 galactic civilizations. These were beings with technology that seemed like magic, with thousands of years of experience in diplomacy and war, with wisdom accumulated over millennia of interstellar civilization, and they were all looking to humanity for answers. We stopped trying to fight them and started trying to understand them, she said simply. The Devourers aren't conquerors or destroyers. They're cosmic gardeners. They consume civilizations that have become stagnant to prevent galactic entropy. Entropy? High Chancellor Vextar leaned forward. Explain Dr. Richard Hayes, who had been invited to address the council as humanity's expert on Devourer psychology, activated a holographic display. The universe tends toward increasing disorder unless energy is actively applied to maintain or create organization. The Devourers discovered long ago that civilizations follow the same principle. Without challenge, without pressure to grow and change, species become static. They stop exploring, stop questioning, stop evolving. And static civilizations eventually die, Brooks continued. Not from war or disaster, but from simple stagnation. The Devourers prevent this by consuming civilizations before they can spread their stagnation to other species. Ambassador Zekth's clicking grew more agitated. But the council species are not stagnant. We continue to advance our technology and expand our knowledge. With respect, Ambassador, Dr. Hayes replied. When was the last time any council species fundamentally changed how they approached a problem? Your technology advances, but your thinking patterns remain the same. You explore new worlds, but using the same exploration methods you've used for centuries. You expand your knowledge, but within the same conceptual frameworks you've always used. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. High Chancellor Vexitar spoke slowly. You are suggesting that the Council itself represents the kind of stagnation the Devourers were created to prevent. Not created, Brooks corrected. Evolved. The Devourers were once a normal spacefaring species, but they encountered the same problem the galaxy faces now. What happens when growth stops? They chose to become agents of change rather than victims of stagnation. Admiral Thisara's stone-like features showed something resembling understanding. And humanity offered them an alternative to consumption as a method of preventing stagnation. We offered to help them make civilizations uncomfortable in non-destructive ways, Brooks confirmed. Humans are naturally disruptive. We ask uncomfortable questions. We challenge established ways of doing things. We try approaches that seem inefficient or risky. Instead of consuming stagnant civilizations, we could work together to unstagnate them. Dr. Hayes added more detail to his holographic presentation. The Devourers have agreed to a trial program. They've identified 47 civilizations showing signs of dangerous stagnation. Instead of consuming them, they want to see if Human intervention can stimulate new growth patterns. What kind of intervention? High Chancellor Vextar asked. Brooks smiled, and for the first time since entering the chamber she felt truly confident. The kind only humans would think of. We're going to help those civilizations by being ourselves. We'll ask questions they've stopped asking, try approaches they've dismissed as impractical, and generally make them so uncomfortable with their assumptions that they'll have to start growing again. And if this fails, Admiral Thisara rumbled, then the Devourers resume their consumption activities and we're back where we started, Brooks admitted. But if it works, we'll have turned the galaxy's greatest threat into its greatest tool for preventing civilizational decay. Ambassador Zekth was quiet for a long moment before speaking. The Klaxon hegemony owes humanity an apology. We underestimated your species' potential contribution to galactic affairs. Keep your apologies, Brooks replied, echoing the words Captain Morrison had used months earlier. But there is something humanity would like to propose. The Chamber's attention focused entirely on her. The Galactic Council has done an admirable job of maintaining stability and preserving existing civilizations for thousands of years. But the universe doesn't want stability. It wants growth, change, evolution. What if instead of just maintaining what exists, we actively work to build something better? She gestured to the holographic star charts that now showed green zones where Devourer restoration projects were underway. There are millions of worlds that could support life but remain empty. Billions of species that could be uplifted to spacefaring status. Entire sectors of space that remain unexplored because they're considered too dangerous or too unstable. You propose expansion beyond current council territories? High Chancellor Vextar asked. We propose that the galaxy stop playing defense and start playing offense against stagnation itself. Humanity volunteers to take on the challenges that other species consider too risky, too difficult, or too unpredictable. We'll explore the dangerous sectors. We'll attempt to communicate with hostile species. We'll try to solve problems that don't have comfortable solutions. Dr. Hayes expanded the star chart to show the full scope of their proposal. The Terran Exploration Initiative, jointly sponsored by the Galactic Council and our new partners among the Devourers. Humanity will serve as the galaxy's agents of beneficial disruption, working to ensure that no civilization becomes so comfortable that it stops growing. Admiral Thisara spoke with something resembling respect in her rumbling voice. You would risk your entire species for the sake of galactic advancement. We would risk stagnation for the sake of growth, Brooks corrected. That's what makes us human. We're biologically incapable of leaving well enough alone, genetically, programmed to make things more complicated than they need to be, and culturally committed to asking questions that don't have easy answers. High Chancellor Vextar looked around the chamber at his fellow council members. All in favor of establishing the Terran Exploration Initiative as proposed? The vote was unanimous as the session concluded and the various species began filing out of the chamber. Captain Brooks reflected on the journey that had brought them here. 6 months ago, Captain Morrison had sat in these same seats and been laughed at for suggesting that humanity could contribute to solving the galaxy's greatest crisis. Now humans walked through the corridors of the council chambers as equal partners, working alongside alien engineers to design ships that could explore impossible places, collaborating with xenobiologists to develop first contact protocols for hostile species, and planning missions to sectors of space that had been considered too dangerous to approach. The Devourers had become allies rather than enemies, their vast fleets now working to create rather than consume. Former battlegrounds were being transformed into research stations where humans and aliens worked together to understand the fundamental principles of civilizational growth. But perhaps most importantly, the galaxy itself had begun to change. Species that had remained unchanged for thousands of years were suddenly asking new questions, trying new approaches, challenging assumptions they had taken for granted. The mere presence of humans in galactic affairs had created ripple effects of curiosity and innovation that spread far beyond anything humanity could have accomplished through direct intervention. As Captain Brooks prepared to depart for humanity's first official mission under the Terran Exploration Initiative, she received a final communication from Admiral Carter on Earth. Remember, Captain, you're not just representing humanity out there. You're representing the principle that growth is always possible. that change is always an option, and that the best response to an impossible problem is to approach it from an impossible direction. Understood, Admiral. We'll make sure the galaxy keeps growing. The UES Defiance, now the flagship of the Terran Exploration Initiative, slipped into hyperspace carrying humanity toward the most dangerous, unstable. The UES Defiance dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 442 system, and Captain Amy Brooks immediately knew they had arrived in the middle of hell. The tactical display lit up with thousands of contacts as the ship's sensors tried to make sense of the chaos spread across three-dimensional Space Council ships were everywhere. But they were scattered and fleeing rather than fighting in formation. The elegant crystal structures of Zephyrian vessels tumbled through space, their translucent hulls cracked and leaking atmosphere. Klaxon ships, normally perfectly coordinated in their insect-like swarm patterns, flew in desperate individual escape attempts. Even the massive Gorvani dreadnoughts built like floating mountains and supposedly unsinkable were breaking apart under sustained attack. And everywhere, consuming everything they touched, were the Devourers Captain Brooks had studied the intelligence reports, but seeing them in person was different. The Devourer ships looked alive, like they had been grown rather than built. Their hulls seemed to be made of metal that flowed like liquid, constantly changing shape and configuration. As she watched, one of the smaller Devourer vessels literally ate a piece of debris from a destroyed Council ship, and she could see its hull expanding and strengthening. "My God," whispered Commander Pete Davis from his position at the tactical station. "They're not just destroying the fleet, they're feeding on it." Lieutenant Commander Sarah Williams was monitoring communications from her station. "Captain, I'm picking up a transmission from the Council flagship. Admiral Thysa Ara is requesting immediate evacuation support for her remaining vessels." Captain Brooks opened the communication channel. The massive stone features of the Gorvani Admiral appeared on the main screen, and Brooks could see stress fractures running across her rocky skin. Behind her, the bridge of her ship was filled with smoke and the sound of damage control teams working frantically. "This is Admiral Thysa of the 3rd Council Fleet to unknown vessel," the Gorvani rumbled, her voice strained. "Identify yourself and retreat immediately. We are facing a full Devourer swarm. Your single ship cannot survive here." "Admiral, this is Captain Amy Brooks of the Terran Navy vessel UES Defiance. We're here to assist your fleet." There was a pause, and Brooks could see confusion in the Admiral's ancient features. "Terran? You mean human? Captain Brooks, you must retreat now. Whatever your leadership told you about this war, the reality is far worse. We have lost 60% of our fleet in the past 4 hours. These are not enemies you can fight with conventional weapons." "Good thing we don't use conventional weapons," Brooks replied. "Admiral, we're not here to evacuate your people. We're here to fight." Admiral Thysa's 3 eyes widened in what Brooks recognized as the Gorvani expression for disbelief. "Captain, I have fought wars for over 3,000 years. I have seen civilizations rise and fall. I am telling you as clearly as possible, retreat or die." Brooks looked around at her bridge crew. Commander Davis was studying the tactical situation with the calm focus of a submarine commander who had spent years fighting in impossible conditions. Lieutenant Commander Williams was already plotting attack vectors that made no apparent tactical sense. The rest of her crew, all volunteers who had trained for months under the Phoenix Protocol, looked ready for whatever came next. "Admiral, with respect, we appreciate the warning, but we came here to do a job and we're going to do it." The communication ended as another massive explosion lit up the space around Admiral Thysa's flagship. The Devourer swarm was closing in for what looked like the final assault on the remaining Council forces. "All right, people," Brooks announced to her crew. "Remember everything Dr. Hayes taught us. We're not trying to win this battle using their rules. We're trying to change the rules entirely. Commander Davis, implement the confusion protocol." "Aye, Captain." All fighters break formation and initiate individual random flight patterns. This was the moment that would later be studied in military academies across the galaxy, because what happened next violated every principle of space combat that had been developed over thousands of years of interstellar warfare. Instead of approaching the battle in formation, the Defiance's fighter squadrons broke apart, and began flying in patterns that served no apparent strategic purpose. Some fighters flew directly toward the enemy and then veered away at the last second. Others began spinning while firing, creating spiraling weapon traces that looked more like fireworks than military action. A few fighters even began flying backwards, using their rear-facing thrusters to maintain combat speed while facing the wrong direction. The Devourers, who had been efficiently coordinating their final assault on the Council remnants, suddenly found themselves trying to counter tactics that made no logical sense. Commander Davis launched what appeared to be a direct suicide run at the largest Devourer capital ship. The living metal vessel prepared to absorb the impact and add the human fighter's mass to its own. But at the last possible second, Davis activated the Defiance's experimental quantum bounce drive. The technology was based on principles that human physicists barely understood, borrowed from Zephyrian research and modified in ways that violated several laws of physics. Instead of crashing into the Devourer ship, Davis's fighter disappeared from one location and reappeared behind the enemy formation, having somehow teleported through space in a way that should have been impossible. The Devourers had encountered teleportation technology before, but never used in such a tactically pointless way. Davis wasn't behind enemy lines to launch a surprise attack or gather intelligence. He was there simply to confuse them about where human forces might appear next. Lieutenant Commander Williams took this chaos as her cue to implement what she called the swarm of confusion. Her squadron of fighters began deliberately ramming their damaged vessels into Devourer ships, but not to cause damage. Instead, they created debris fields in specific patterns that interfered with Devourer sensors and movement. "Captain," she reported over the communication system while her fighter spun wildly through a cloud of wreckage. "I'm reading massive confusion in the enemy formation. They're trying to adapt to our tactics, but they can't figure out what our tactics actually are." "That's because we don't have tactics," Brooks replied. "We have chaos with a purpose they can't understand." The battle continued for 3 hours, and during that time, something unprecedented happened in the history of galactic warfare. The Devourers, who had been winning every engagement for 50 years, found themselves unable to predict or counter human behavior. Human fighters would attack in ways that seemed designed to get them killed, only to survive through luck or skill that appeared random. Human ships would retreat at moments when victory seemed possible, and advance when defeat seemed certain. Human weapons would fire at empty space, creating patterns of energy that served no obvious tactical purpose, but somehow interfered with Devourer coordination. Admiral Thisara watched this display from her damaged flagship with growing amazement. "What are they doing?" she rumbled to her tactical officer, I believe. The smaller Gorvani replied, "They are fighting like humans." But the real surprise came when Captain Brooks implemented the most human strategy of all. Instead of trying to destroy the Devourers or drive them away, she opened a direct communication channel to the enemy fleet, Devourer vessels. "This is Captain Amy Brooks of the Terran Navy. I know you can understand us because your technology requires language processing to consume our communications and incorporate our knowledge. I have a question for you. For the first time in recorded galactic history, a Devourer fleet stopped fighting in the middle of a battle. The living metal ships hung motionless in space, apparently processing this unexpected development. In all your thousands of years of consuming civilizations, have you ever encountered a species that wanted to be consumed?" The pause stretched longer. Around the battlefield, council ships that had been preparing for death suddenly found themselves in an eerie calm. "Because that's what we are," Brooks continued. "We're not trying to win this battle the way everyone else fights. We're trying to understand you. Every ship you destroy teaches us more about what you are. Every tactic you counter shows us how you think. Every adaptation you make gives us new information about your goals." Admiral Thisara's communication system crackled to life. "Captain Brooks, what are you doing?" "Something no one else has tried, Admiral. Instead of fighting them like they're an enemy to be defeated, I'm approaching them like they're a puzzle to be solved." The Devourer fleet remained motionless for another long moment, and then something happened that no council historian would believe if they hadn't recorded it themselves. The Devourers began to retreat, not fleeing from superior force or tactical disadvantage, but pulling back as if they needed time to process what they had encountered. Their formation dissolved as individual ships seemed to be communicating with each other in ways that suggested confusion rather than coordination. All Council vessels. Admiral Thisara broadcast across the surviving fleet. Maintain position, but do not pursue. I have never seen the enemy behave this way before. Captain Brooks watched the Devourer swarm disappear into the darkness beyond the system's edge, leaving behind a battlefield unlike any in galactic history. For the first time, in 50 years, the Devourer fleet had withdrawn to the edge of the Kepler 442 system, but Captain Amy Brooks knew they hadn't given up. Through her ship's long-range sensors, she could see the living metal vessels arranged in patterns that suggested intense communication. They were learning, adapting, trying to understand what they had encountered. "They're not retreating," she told Admiral Thisara during their emergency conference call. The Gorvani commander's flagship hung nearby, its stone-like hull scarred from the battle but still intact. "They're regrouping. Whatever we did confused them, but they're figuring out how to counter it." Admiral Thisara's ancient features showed concern. "In 3,000 years of warfare, Captain, I have never seen the Devourers withdraw from a tactical engagement. They consume everything in their path, regardless of resistance. What did your people do to them?" "We treated them like a problem, to be solved instead of an enemy to be destroyed," Brooks replied. "But that advantage won't last long. The Devourers are learning machines. Give them enough time, and they'll find a way to counter even our chaos." Commander Pete Davis looked up from his tactical station. "Captain, I'm reading movement in the enemy formation. They're beginning to advance again, but something's different." Lieutenant Commander Sarah Williams confirmed his readings. "Their approach pattern has changed completely. Instead of their usual coordinated swarm tactics, they're moving in random formations. They're trying to copy our unpredictability." Brooks studied the tactical display with growing understanding. "They're adapting faster than we expected. If they learn to fight like us, we lose our only advantage." The second engagement began differently from any battle in galactic history. Instead of the Devourer's usual efficient assault patterns, both fleets approached each other using seemingly random movements. But there was a crucial difference that became apparent within the first few minutes of combat. The Devourers were trying to be unpredictable in predictable ways. Their random movements followed mathematical patterns that could be analyzed and anticipated. They were using chaos as a tool the same way they used any other weapon. Humans, on the other hand, were unpredictable because they were genuinely chaotic. When Commander Davis suddenly broke formation to investigate what looked like empty space, he wasn't following any tactical protocol. He was curious about a sensor reading that made no sense. When Lieutenant Commander Williams began spinning her fighter while firing at what appeared to be random directions, she wasn't implementing a planned maneuver. She was trying to create a specific pattern of energy discharges that might interfere with Devourer coordination systems. The difference became crucial when the battle reached its turning point. "Captain," Williams reported over the communication system, "the Devourers are countering our every move, but they're doing it too perfectly. They're predicting our chaos instead of understanding it." Brooks realized what Williams meant. The enemy had learned to anticipate human unpredictability by treating it as another form of tactics to be mastered, but they couldn't grasp the fundamental human approach to warfare, that sometimes the best strategy was to have no strategy at all. "All ships," Brooks broadcast to her fleet, "implement protocol insanity." This was the moment Dr. Hayes had warned them about during their training on Earth. Protocol insanity wasn't a battle plan or a tactical framework. It was permission to stop thinking like military officers and start thinking like humans. What followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. Human ships began fighting their own fleet as much as they fought the Devourers. Commander Davis launched what appeared to be an attack on Lieutenant Commander Williams, forcing her to dodge wildly through space in a pattern that accidentally created a debris field that trapped 3 Devourer vessels. Williams retaliated by firing at Davis's position, missing deliberately but creating energy discharges that interfered with his navigation systems. This forced Davis to crash land on a nearby asteroid, where he used his ship's mining lasers to carve geometric patterns into the rock surface. The Devourers tried to analyze these patterns, assuming they must be some form of tactical communication. While they were distracted by trying to decode meaningless geometric shapes, human fighters slipped past their defenses and began what could only be described as aggressive hugging. Instead of trying to destroy Devourer ships, human pilots began attaching their fighters to enemy vessels using magnetic clamps and mining cables. They weren't trying to cause damage. They were trying to create physical connections that would force the living metal ships to carry extra mass and awkward attachments. The Devourers had no experience with enemies who tried to become part of their fleet rather than destroy it. Their adaptation protocols couldn't process the concept of hostile cooperation. But Captain Brooks had saved the most human tactic for last Devourer fleet. She broadcast across all communication channels. "This is Captain Brooks again. I want to continue our conversation from earlier. You withdrew when I asked about species that wanted to be consumed. I think that means you're not just destroyers. You're selectors. You choose what to consume based on criteria we don't understand." The battle continued around them, but Brooks could see that individual Devourer ships were pausing to process her communication. "Here's what I think. You don't consume civilizations because you're evil or because you need resources. You consume them because they've stopped growing, because they've become stagnant, because they represent endpoints rather than possibilities." Admiral Thaisara's voice cut into the communication channel. "Captain Brooks, what are you doing?" "Talking to them like they're intelligent beings instead of forces of nature," Brooks replied. "Admiral, has the Council ever tried negotiating with the Devourers?" "They cannot be negotiated with. They have never responded to any communication attempts. That's because no one has ever offered them what they actually want." Brooks continued her broadcast to the Devourer fleet. "Every species you encounter either runs away to preserve what they have or fights to protect what they've built. Both reactions are about maintaining the status quo. But what if you encountered a species that actively sought change, growth, evolution?" The space around them fell silent, except for the background hum of ship systems and weapons charging. Even the chaotic human fighters seemed to be waiting for a response. When it came, the voice that answered was unlike anything in galactic records. It wasn't the usual electronic translation of alien speech. It was something that bypassed language entirely and spoke directly to the understanding of everyone who heard it. "You offer to be consumed willingly?" "No," Brooks replied. "We offer to consume alongside you. Not planets or civilizations, but stagnation itself. Instead of destroying species that have stopped growing, we could challenge them to start growing again." The pause that followed lasted for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Around the battlefield, ships from both fleets hung, motionless, waiting for whatever would happen next. "You propose partnership in change rather than preservation in stasis." "Exactly. The galaxy is huge, with billions of worlds and countless species. Most of them are probably stagnant, stuck in patterns that have worked for thousands of years. But what if instead of consuming them, we challenge them to evolve?" Admiral Thaisara's communication channel crackled with static. "Captain, are you seriously attempting to negotiate an alliance with the greatest threat the galaxy has ever known?" "I'm attempting to solve a problem that military force hasn't been able to handle for 50 years, Brooks replied. "Admiral, the Devourers aren't evil, they're gardeners. They consume civilizations that have stopped growing to make room for new growth. But humans are a species that never stops changing, never stops challenging ourselves, never stops looking for new ways to approach old problems." The Devourer response came faster this time. "Your species demonstrates this through warfare behavior that serves no logical purpose. Our species demonstrates this through everything we do. We build things that are harder than they need to be. We explore places that are dangerous for no practical reason. We ask questions that don't have comfortable answers. We're biologically incapable of leaving well enough alone. And you propose that this biological incapability could be applied to the gardening of galactic civilization." Brooks smiled, though she knew the Devourers couldn't see her expression. "I propose that humanity could help you find alternatives to consumption. Instead of destroying stagnant civilizations, We could work together to unstagnate them. Make them uncomfortable enough to start growing again. The longest pause yet followed. Her words. When the Devourer voice returned, it carried something that sounded almost like curiosity. This proposal requires further analysis. We will suspend consumption activities in this sector, pending evaluation of human collaborative potential. And just like that, the first ceasefire in the 50-year war against the Devourers began, not with victory or defeat, but with the most human solution imaginable, turning an enemy into a partner by offering to help them do their job better. The Pentagon War Room had seen many crises over the centuries, but nothing quite like this. Admiral Lisa Carter sat at the head of a long table, her weathered hands folded as she listened to Captain Jake Morrison deliver his report. The holographic display showed star charts of the galaxy with red zones marking Devourer activity, spreading like an infection across the outer regions. So they laughed at us, Admiral Carter said after Jake finished speaking. Her voice was calm, but Jake had served under her long enough to recognize the steel beneath the surface. They think we're too primitive to contribute to a war that's been going on since before we invented the printing press. Yes, Admiral, Jake replied. High Chancellor Vextar was polite about it, but the message was clear. Humanity should stick to learning basic spaceflight while the adults handle the real problems. Dr. Richard Hayes leaned forward from his position at the table. As head of the newly formed Department of Xenological Warfare, he had spent the past 6 months analyzing every piece of information they could gather about alien military tactics and technology. Actually, Captain, their dismissal might be the best thing that could have happened to us. Admiral Carter raised an eyebrow. Explain. Dr. Hayes activated his own holographic display, showing intercepted communications and battle reports from Council forces. The Galactic Council has been fighting this war the same way for 50 years. Standard fleet formations, predictable tactics, conventional strategies that every species in the galaxy understands. The problem is, the Devourers understand them, too. Colonel Sam Rogers, Jake's old academy classmate and now head of special operations, studied the tactical displays with interest. You're saying they're fighting a conventional war against an unconventional enemy? Exactly, Dr. Hayes continued. Look at these battle reports. Every engagement follows the same pattern. Council forces establish firing lines, attempt to control space, focus on protecting their capital ships while using smaller vessels for screening. It's textbook interstellar warfare, perfected over thousands of years. Admiral Carter nodded slowly. And the Devourers counter every move perfectly because they've seen it all before. Every species the Devourers have encountered follows predictable patterns, Dr. Hayes said, highlighting different sections of the star chart. They either flee to preserve their civilization, or they fight using the same conventional tactics their species has developed over millennia. The Devourers have had 50,000 years to learn how to counter every possible variation of standard military doctrine. Jake leaned back in his chair, beginning to understand where this was heading. But humans don't use standard military doctrine. That's putting it mildly, Colonel Rogers said with a grin. Remember the Battle of New Singapore, when we strapped nuclear warheads to cargo containers and launched them at the enemy using civilian transport ships? Or the Titan defense, when we used mining lasers and construction mechs to hold off a fleet of warships? Dr. Hayes pulled up historical records from Earth's conflicts. Every major human military victory has involved doing something that made no logical sense from a survival standpoint. We sacrifice pawns to capture queens. We retreat into attacks. We use our weaknesses as weapons. Admiral Carter stood and walked to the main display, studying the spread of red zones across the galaxy. The Council species have spent millennia perfecting the art of war. They fight efficiently, logically, with minimal losses and maximum effectiveness, and that predictability is exactly what's getting them killed, Dr. Hayes added. The Devourers have evolved to counter logical warfare, but they've never fought humans before. What do you need? Admiral Carter asked. Dr. Hayes smiled, and for the first time since Jake had returned from the council chambers, someone looked genuinely excited about humanity's prospects. Everything, Admiral, and I mean everything. Over the following months, humanity began an unprecedented mobilization, unlike anything in its history. But this wasn't just about building ships or training soldiers. Dr. Hayes had convinced Admiral Carter that if they were going to fight an impossible war, they needed to do it in an impossible way. The project was codenamed Phoenix Protocol, and it operated under a principle that would have seemed insane to any other species in the galaxy. If conventional warfare hadn't worked for 50 years, then humanity would approach the problem from directions that conventional thinking couldn't. Even Imagine engineers worked alongside poets trying to design weapons that would confuse rather than destroy. Soldiers trained with circus performers to learn how to move in ways that would seem random to an observer, but served tactical purposes. Scientists collaborated with philosophers to develop strategies that would challenge the fundamental assumptions about what warfare should accomplish. Captain Amy Brooks found herself pulled from her position, commanding a deep space patrol vessel, to lead the most unusual project in human military history. Her ship, the UES Defiance, was being completely rebuilt from the ground up using principles that violated every standard of military engineering. The idea is controlled chaos, Dr. Hayes explained as they toured the shipyard where the Defiance was taking shape. Traditional warships are designed for predictable performance. Every system has backups, every component is tested to exact specifications, every crew member knows exactly what their job is at any given moment. Captain Brooks studied the blueprints, with a mixture of fascination and concern. And this ship? This ship is designed to be unpredictable. The weapons can be reconfigured in real time. The propulsion system can switch between 6 different operational modes. Even the crew assignments change randomly during combat. Commander Pete Davis, a former submarine warfare specialist who understood 3-dimensional combat better than most space officers, examined the tactical systems. It's like building a warship that's also a puzzle box. The enemy won't know what we're going to do because we won't know what we're going to do until we do it. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Williams, formerly of the Air Force and known for her unconventional approaches to aerial combat, was even more direct in her assessment. This is either the most brilliant thing humanity has ever conceived, or the most spectacular way we've ever found to commit suicide. Maybe both, Captain Brooks admitted. But if the conventional approach was working, the Council wouldn't need our help. The reconstruction of human military doctrine went far beyond just building strange ships. Training facilities across Earth began teaching tactics that would have been considered symptoms of mental illness in any other context. Soldiers learned to fight while deliberately creating disadvantages for themselves. Pilots practiced maneuvers that served no apparent tactical purpose other than confusing observers. Naval officers studied scenarios where victory was defined, not as defeating the enemy, but as forcing them to question their own understanding of what conflict meant. Dr. Hayes spent long nights in his laboratory, surrounded by holographic displays showing devourer technology and behavior patterns. The more he studied them, the more convinced he became that humanity's approach was not just viable, but necessary. "They're perfect," he told Admiral Carter during one of their late-night briefings. "The Devourers are absolutely perfect at what they do. Their technology adapts instantly to counter any threat. Their tactics evolve in real time to match whatever strategy they encounter. They learn from every battle and become stronger." That doesn't sound like good news, Doctor. It is, though, because perfection is also a weakness. The Devourers have become so good at being efficient, logical, and effective that they can't comprehend inefficiency, illogic, and apparent ineffectiveness. They've never encountered a species that deliberately chooses the harder path, the more dangerous option, the strategy that makes victory more difficult rather than easier. Admiral Carter poured herself another cup of coffee, her 4th of the night. "You're gambling the survival of our species on the idea that being bad at warfare will make us good at it." "Not bad at it," Dr. Hayes corrected. "Different at it. The Devourers consume civilizations by understanding them, by predicting their behavior, by countering their strategies. But you can't counter something you don't understand, and you can't predict behavior that doesn't follow logical patterns." 6 months after Captain Morrison's humiliating experience at the Galactic Council, humanity was ready to test its theory. The UES Defiance and her crew had trained in ways that would have seemed impossible to any other species. They had learned to fight like humans, which meant learning to fight in ways that made no sense to anyone else as Captain Brooks prepared. For departure, she received a final communication from Admiral Carter. "Remember, Captain, you're not trying to win this war. You're trying to change it." "Understood, Admiral. We'll show the galaxy what happens when humans decide to help, whether they want our help or not." The Defiance slipped into hyperspace, carrying humanity's first real contribution to the Galactic War. Behind them on Earth, the Phoenix Protocol continued, preparing weapons and strategies that the galaxy had never seen before. The Council had laughed at humanity's offer to help. Soon they would learn what human help actually looked like. The massive crystal dome stretched far above Captain Jake Morrison's head as he sat in the observer section of the Galactic Council chambers. The structure was so large that clouds formed near its peak, and the air shimmered with different colors as alien atmospheres mixed together in carefully controlled sections. Jake had been coming to these meetings for 6 months now, ever since humanity made first contact with the Zephyrian Republic, but he still felt small in this place. Around him, the representatives of 12 alien civilizations gathered for their monthly assembly. The Zephyrians looked like tall, thin humans made of blue glass with 3 eyes that could see in different directions at once. Their skin was so clear that Jake could see strange organs pulsing inside their bodies. They had built this meeting place and seemed to be in charge of most things. The Klaxons reminded Jake of giant ants, but they walked on 2 legs and wore elaborate robes covered in symbols that hurt his eyes to look at. When they talked, their mandibles clicked together in rapid patterns that somehow became words. Their ships were all curves and flowing lines, like they had been grown instead of built. The Gorvani were the strangest of all. They looked like living mountains, made of gray stone that moved like flesh. When they spoke, it sounded like boulders rolling down a hill, deep and rumbling. Some of them were so old that small plants grew in the cracks of their rocky skin. They moved slowly, but Jake had learned that they were incredibly strong and nearly impossible to kill. There were others too, each stranger than the last. The ethereals looked like floating jellyfish made of light. The mechanics were robots who had gained consciousness long ago and now considered themselves a true species. The Verdani were plant-like beings who smelled like fresh rain and spoke in voices like wind through leaves today. The topic was the same as it had been for the past 3 meetings. The war against the Devourers. Jake had learned that the Devourers were an ancient race that consumed everything in their path. They didn't just destroy planets or kill people. They literally ate entire star systems, leaving nothing behind but empty space. For 50 years, the combined fleets of the Galactic Council had been fighting them, and for 50 years they had been losing. High Chancellor Vextar of the Zephyrians stood at the center of the chamber, his 3 eyes focusing on different parts of the crowd as he spoke. "The situation in the Outer Rim continues to deteriorate," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the dome. "We have lost contact with 17 more systems in the past month. The Devourer advance shows no signs of slowing." Ambassador Zekth of the Klaxons clicked his mandibles rapidly. "Our fleets cannot match their numbers. For every Devourer ship we destroy, 2 more appear. They seem to grow stronger by consuming our technology and our people." Admiral Thisara of the Gorvani rumbled like distant thunder. "Perhaps it is time to consider evacuation of the threatened sectors. We cannot protect what we cannot hold." Jake listened to the discussion with growing frustration. These were the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, with technology that seemed like magic to human eyes. Their ships could cross vast distances in days, their weapons could crack planets, and their computers could think faster than entire human cities. Yet they were losing to an enemy they had been fighting for half a century. Finally, Jake stood up. The observer section was supposed to remain silent during council proceedings, but he couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Permission to speak," he called out. The chamber fell silent. Thousands of alien eyes turned toward him, and Jake felt his heart racing. He was just one human in a room full of beings who had been traveling between stars since before his species had invented the wheel. High Chancellor Vexitar's middle eye focused on Jake, while his other two continued to scan the crowd. "Captain Morrison, you are here as an observer only. The Council is discussing matters of galactic security." "I understand that, Chancellor," Jake replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "But I believe humanity can help with this war effort." The silence stretched for a moment longer, and then something happened that Jake had never heard before in the council chambers. Laughter. Not human laughter, but the alien equivalents. The klaxons' rapid clicking grew faster and higher in pitch. The Zephyrians made a sound like wind chimes in a storm, and the Gorvani's rumbling became rhythmic, like rocks tumbling down a mountainside. Ambassador Zekth was the first to find words through his clicking amusement. "The infant species wishes to help? How charming. Humans have barely left their own solar system. What could you possibly contribute to a war that has challenged the greatest civilizations in the galaxy?" More laughter rippled through the chamber. The ethereals pulsed with colors that Jake's translator implant told him indicated amusement. The Verdani rustled their leaf-like appendages, and what passed for chuckling among their kind, High Chancellor Vextar raised one of his 4 arms for silence, but Jake could see the amusement in all 3 of his eyes. "Captain Morrison, your enthusiasm is notable. However, you must understand the scale of what we face. The Devourers have been fighting interstellar wars since before your species discovered fire. Your entire military consists of primitive, chemical rockets and nuclear weapons. Our enemies laugh at weapons that crude. We have learned much from our contact with your people," Admiral Thisara rumbled, her stone-like features showing what might have been kindness. "But you have been in space for less than a century. We have been fighting this war for longer than your entire recorded history. Perhaps focus on learning to walk before attempting to run." Jake felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. "With respect, Chancellor, we didn't ask for your permission. We asked if you wanted our help." This brought fresh waves of laughter from around the chamber. Even some of the more serious species seemed amused by the humans' persistence. "Your offer is noted, Captain Morrison," High Chancellor Vextar said, his tone patient but dismissive. "However, the Council must focus on realistic solutions to this crisis. We appreciate humanity's eagerness to contribute, but this is a matter for established civilizations with proven military capabilities." The discussion moved on to other topics: evacuation plans, resource allocation, defensive strategies that had failed before and would likely fail again. Jake sat in silence, listening to the most powerful beings in the galaxy talk about retreat and damage control, while an ancient enemy consumed everything in its path. As the meeting concluded, and the various species began to file out of the chamber, Jake remained seated. He watched the aliens leave in their small groups, still making their sounds of amusement at humanity's presumption. The Zephyrians glided away like living glass sculptures. The klaxons scuttled out in precise formations. The massive Gorvani moved like slow-motion avalanches toward the exits. Finally, Jake stood and made his way to his small ship docked at the station's human-compatible bay. As he prepared for the journey back to Earth, he thought about what he had witnessed. The most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, with all their incredible technology and thousands of years of experience, were losing a war. They were so certain of their superiority that they couldn't even consider that a young species might have something to offer. Jake activated his communication system and began recording his report for Earth Command. "This is Captain Morrison reporting from the Galactic Council chambers," he began. "I have an update on the Devourer situation, and I believe we need to have a serious discussion about humanity's role in this war." As his ship pulled away from the crystal structure of the council chambers, Jake looked back at the massive dome, where the galaxy's greatest minds had just dismissed his species as too primitive to matter. They had laughed at humanity's offer to help. Jake had a feeling they wouldn't be laughing for much longer.